Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to the new episode of the Audio Epics Storytelling Podcast. We had a conversation this week that turned out to be quite long, unexpectedly long actually. And so I thought it was a good idea to split this one up in 2 episodes. So coming up next is the first part of our conversation, and then next week we'll have the second part of this particular topic. I hope you'll enjoy it. Hello and welcome to another Audio Epics podcast. And Happy New Year, by the way.
Yeah, Happy New Year. I hope you enjoyed the holidays. We try to. We've been very busy, but we're very excited to be back with another episode.
Yes, here we are. And what is today's episode about?
It's about viewpoints in storytelling. With viewpoints, we don't mean points of view or different opinions when it comes to storytelling.
Right, yeah, no.
But we're going to talk about actual points of view used in the narration, mainly in written stories.
Yeah, this is mostly a topic that pertains to, novels, etc. Although I think it also has its place in the cinema.
Right. And we'll try to talk about that. We don't want to make this course on how to write an excellent novel, because there's a lot of information on the internet about this. Brandon Sanderson has great YouTube videos about points of view in narration. So we don't want to make this a course, but just talk to you a little bit about the different points of view you can use.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be aware of it even.
No, I think it's probably a more recent phenomenon that writers are very conscious of the viewpoints that they use. In the past, they weren't so much.
Exactly.
But it is important to know about it these days, I think.
Right, and I think readers have become more critical of it as well, because readers didn't really used to pay much attention to it in the past.
So, roughly, what kind of viewpoints do we have?
Well, I think if we start with the oldest and most popular one, I think a third-person narrator is still very popular, especially in fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah, and in all kinds of genres, yeah. I'd say. But these genres in particular are very fit for it.
And these are the genres we read most, right?
Yeah, we talk about most. That's really what the podcast is mostly about, although we also talk about other stuff. You have 2 kinds of narrator that you can use. There's the omniscient perspective, the all-knowing narrator, which is really, what most stories used to be like. Think of any fairy tale a long time ago in a kingdom far, far away. There's this grandfatherly figure who knows everything and tells you exactly what happened, knowing all the thoughts and feelings of every character.
Right. Then you have a limited perspective also within that third-person narrator. That's a narrator who usually follows one character, so he doesn't tell the thoughts of other characters, for example. You experience the story through a character's lens.
Right,
but it's not the character talking.
Yeah, so a good example of that, I think, would be Harry Potter, where you mostly follow the story through Harry's perspective. So the narrator is always saying, Harry felt this, Harry thought that, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. So it's in third person. It's talking about Harry. It's not Harry talking. But we know everything about his thoughts, his feelings, and not about other people's thoughts and feelings.
You tend to feel sympathy for the character described, obviously.
Yes. Okay, and then, of course, second person.
Yeah, but that's, especially in literature, it's more experimental. It's this choose your own adventure approach.
It's not exactly literary, choose your own adventure. I guess it's the kind of story where you'd have a sentence like, you walk into a bar and you address the barkeeper.
It's not very popular, so we won't spend a lot of time on this POV.
Okay, fair enough. And then, of course, there's first person.
Yeah, that's a very popular point of view nowadays, especially since the rise of YA fiction.
Right, yeah, that's true. The first person is I.
Yeah, me.
It's all about me.
Yeah, and I think that's very appealing to especially teenagers because they like to feel immersed in a certain character. Brandon Sanderson distinguishes three subtypes of this first person.
3.
Yeah.
There are 3 versions of I.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's deep.
I, me, and my. No, he distinguishes the storyteller, which often blends into a third-person omniscient. It's more traditional. It's one character who tells the story and seems to know all the details. So,
Right. Okay. So it's what you're talking about is an omniscient narrator who also addresses the audience once in a while.
I guess
That's what it is.
I'm not really sure about. I don't really have an example in mind, actually.
I think it would be something like I think C.S. Lewis does that in the Narnia books. For example, this story takes place when your grandfather was still very small, and I remember what candy was like back then.
Oh, okay.
Yada yada yada.
Yeah.
And I think Eustace was being very unpleasant, and
That's kind of charming, actually.
yeah, I think that's what it is. Personally, I see it as a third-person narration. It's just that the narrator, it's just an omniscient narrator, and occasionally he turns to the audience. Instead of just being this detached narrator, he's a person. He has opinions and thoughts.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Nice thing to experiment
It
with.
sounds really experimental, but it's actually extremely traditional.
And
So,
then a
yeah.
second type he distinguishes is reflection. So one character is reflecting on a number of events, and that is very popular in YA.
Yeah, so you mean something happened years ago and now you're telling it to your children, that kind of thing?
That kind of thing, yeah. You can use the past for that if you want to reflect on something.
So that's, I remember it like it was yesterday. So that kind of storytelling.
That kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
And the third type is the camera, which is more modern. It's
Very cinematic.
It's very cinematic, and in that way, if you use that, it would seem that your novel could be easily adapted to screen, because you're already describing everything in a very cinematic way.
Yeah, or a video game if it's first person.
Right.
So it's sort of, it's happening now. You're in it.
Yeah.
So it seems to go well with the present tense then.
Exactly. So that's a brief outline. We're going to try to describe these points of view more in depth without making this a course for.
No, we just want to go a bit
writers.
deeper and sort of delve into where these viewpoints might be attractive, how they could be used, examples of perhaps stories, books, movies, whatever that use them.
Yeah, I think if you're an aspiring writer, it can be interesting to know about these things, just so you know you're consistent with your point of view.
Yes, and if we're talking about writing, tense also.
Yeah.
Viewpoint and tense are linked when it comes to writing
Exactly.
a story. Not so much in the cinema, of course, not at all. But if you're writing a story, yeah, you have to choose between tenses.
Mm-hmm.
So we might perhaps go over those.
Yeah, so you basically have three tenses, the past, the present, and the future tense. But actually, in practice, I think future tense is not really used, right?
No, not even in science fiction, actually. Yeah. One day, someone will go to a spaceship and he will open a door, and he will. Yeah, it would be very tedious to read a book like that.
Yeah.
The word will would be on every page 20 times. So that, yeah, I think for that reason it's not really
But if
used.
you want to experiment
Yeah.
with that,
Yeah, sure. Anything's possible.
We're very curious about the result then.
But yeah, I guess normally you choose between past and present.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about these tenses within a certain point of view. It can create a very different kind of writing.
Okay, let's talk about third person.
So what I like about a third person is that it's a timeless point of view. It used to be the normal way of telling a story, but nowadays it's still used a lot and it's still very effective, right?
Yeah, I kind of see it as the default point of view.
Yeah.
Third person, past tense, seems to me like that's the normal way you would write a story. And then, of course, there's still the question: are you going for an omniscient narrator or a limited perspective?
I think both still work. An omniscient is, of course, an all-knowing narrator, like a god. The narrator knows all about his characters, and that can be very liberating because you can actually put in all information you like.
Yes,
that
but
way.
but it has drawbacks as well. I think, for example, it can be a bit confusing. You switch around so much. I mean, if you don't do it well, you switch around so much between different viewpoints within the same scene that it's it might feel jarring to be in one person's mind and then in another person's mind. But it can be done well.
That's why I think when you use an omniscient narrator well, I think the writers who do use it, they tend to stick to occasionally talking about thoughts and feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But they will rather describe more physical experiences of the characters and than emotional experiences, because I think that's more clear to the reader that way.
Yeah. If I think about the Lord of the Rings, first mention for this podcast, what he does there is it is an omniscient narrator, and occasionally there's a little bit of extra information on how a character feels, or a character is reminiscing about something or particularly moved by something, and then that is described. And then the story just goes on from this sort of more bird's eye perspective, sort of top-down, watching the characters go about their business.
Yeah.
Perspective.
So Tolkien is kind of a storyteller in that case.
Absolutely, very much so. And in The Hobbit, he even, in The Lord of the Rings he doesn't, but in The Hobbit he even does the first-person storyteller thing that we mentioned, where he gives his own opinions about what characters are doing.
Right.
To go back to the sort of omniscient narrator, a good example of that, where it is done well, would be Dune, I think.
Yeah, why would you say so?
Because in Dune, you have, in each scene, there's a lot of dialogue in that book. And in each scene, you really get the perspective of everyone involved. He writes down what they think, and he does so mostly by just writing thoughts down, in italics.
Right, and it's clear also who is thinking what.
Yeah.
And because he does that, he makes the story more exciting. Because, for example, the motivations of a character who's planning on doing something bad.
Yeah.
And the other characters don't know, so that kind of creates a tension.
You know in advance that he's going to do something bad.
Yeah, I love that about Dune.
That's true.
Nowadays, I prefer a limited perspective more, because I tend to feel more immersed in a story that way.
It definitely is more popular these days. If you read a novel that was written in the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years, it's most likely written from a limited perspective.
Yeah. And in a third person, you can actually have as many characters as you like, and that makes it so suitable for epic fantasy. I think you can have gazillion characters
And viewpoints.
and viewpoints that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in these massive series like The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, etc., are good examples of stories where you can, have a different viewpoint in each chapter, and so that can create an epic feel because you have all these, of this vast scale and all these.
Would you say that the more characters you have in a fantasy setting, the more epic it becomes?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's not because you have a lot of characters that it's super epic. I mean, you can have 140 characters and still just have a tweet.
Yeah, I think you're right. The epicness of a story depends on many factors. We've talked about that in our first episode, actually, about length and epicness. That's another factor, for example.
Yeah. I mean, you could have an epic story from a first person perspective, possibly. I think that's possible, and have it be really massive in scale, but see it all through the eyes of one character. That's possible.
Right.
But many characters does make for a more sort of world overview sort of thing, maybe.
Yeah, what I think is also interesting about a limited perspective, a third person limited, is that you can withhold information, limit the narration to what that character would know, and how that character looks at the world, the events that take place, other characters. So you see everything from their perspective, through their eyes, actually.
So, and because you can withhold certain information, you can spring certain plot twists on the reader.
Right.
More easily.
Right, and also it makes your characters more interesting in a way, because they can be flawed or they can be wrong, and that's more exciting for the story, I think.
Yeah, it's also interesting that if you have a character from a very different culture than ours, for example, and this is something that Brandon Sanderson does very well in Words of Radiance, the second Stormlight Archive book. He has a few chapters from the viewpoint of one of the characters who are from this very different race. It's very different people who are not human.
Mm-hmm.
And they have their culture and the way they think and the way they communicate is very, very different from anything human. But he has a few chapters from their perspective, and it's fascinating to sort of see the world through this completely different lens, different expectations, different priorities in life, etc.
Right. And you can know all motivations of these characters as well. You don't even have to italicize their thoughts. You can just describe a scene as they would experience it.
Yeah. For example, you could have a chapter from the viewpoint of the villain, and say, for example, the villain hates children. Just saying something. And you could
eats them.
Yeah, and you could write something like children were so delicious with with a bit of extra special sauce, and because it's from the villain's viewpoint, you don't have to italicize this thought of, I think children are delicious,
No, he would just he would watch a little boy and he would describe it as there was a chubby little boy with rosy cheeks, because he would focus on things like that, right?
Yes, and I think that's one of the strengths of books as opposed to other storytelling media, is getting inside the mind of a character and even the way they taste and smell and see things.
Exactly.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and when you have the viewpoint of different characters, you can do this in very different ways and for different purposes. You can, for example, have a character that represents a different narrative function, for example, as described by Russian formalist Vladimir Prop. We might actually talk about that in later episodes. Or you can, like you mentioned before, you can pick a viewpoint for the protagonist and a viewpoint for the antagonist, the bad guy.
Right.
That's especially interesting in chases because
But yeah, if the chase goes on over multiple chapters,
exactly.
yeah.
The Da Vinci Code is a good example of that, of using that point of view in a chase. I mean, in getting historical facts right, for that matter. But in the Da Vinci Code, you have the viewpoint of Silas, the bad guy, and Robert Langdon, the main character. And Robert gets chased by the bad guy, and by getting into the mind of the bad guy, you know that he's actually quite close to catching him. And that creates a constant tension that makes you want to turn the pages and read on. So, in terms of creating excitement, Dan Brown is doing a real good job.
That the point you make about using the antagonist's perspective to create tension reminds me of something in movies, but we'll talk about that later on. But yeah, I'll hold that thought. Okay, so to wrap limited perspective up, it's used a lot in epic stories, so it works in fantasy. Um, Writers like Tad Williams and Robert Jordan are notoriously good at it. Brandon Sanderson, of course, as well. So and that's great because you can switch viewpoints and get an epic story across from different perspectives.
Right, would you say there are downsides to the limited perspective?
That depends on whether you like or dislike a steep learning curve. You know, I speak, of course, from the perspective of fantasy, world building, etc. A lot of the time in fantasy, what really defines the genre is this learning curve. As a reader, you have to sort of get to know the world, get to know the setting, and you have to learn about it. And in this limited perspective, third person narration, it sort of it tends to have the effect that you get a lot of world building info dumps and jargon onto your plate.
Yeah, and of course, from the character's perspective, the information is obvious. So you have to keep up as a reader, and that makes it challenging with all the new words and concepts and ideas. Yeah, I understand.
Like the Jedi entered his X-wing, and you know, sort of these words are now familiar to us because Star Wars is so well known. But imagine that Star Wars didn't exist, and you'd read about things like that, you wouldn't be able to follow.
And of course, as an omniscient narrator, you can explain all these things and take your time. And as a limited narrator, you really need to get on with the story. And you mention all these things.
You could explain that in a limited narration, but it kind of feels, it always feels a bit clumsy. You know, he took his XYZ. It was a special suit that was made for surviving in outer space. That kind of breaks the immersion of being inside that character's mind.
Right.
It has to be sort of, obvious that an XYZ is a spacesuit.
It is obvious. Everyone knows an XYZ is a spacesuit. Isn't another downside of a limited perspective that it's hard to use if you want an unreliable narrator? Because if you know what the character thinks and feels, it's hard to keep information from the reader that way. If you want to do that, if you want to use that in your story and plot building. So if a character would withhold information, he would have to say things like, oh, I can't think about that.
Right.
It's too traumatic,
Yeah,
or
okay.
I want to forget that, or something, and that makes it a bit unnatural. So the reader actually, to make it credible, I think the reader should know everything the character knows or doesn't know.
Yeah, Sanderson does something interesting with this in the Stormlight archive. There is one of the main characters has a person in his past that obviously he wanted to forget, or someone has blocked this person from his memory. He used to be married, and from time to time, other people will talk to him about his wife that he used to be married to. But since through some kind of magical process, his memory about his wife was erased, every time someone mentions her, he just hears this sound when they say her name.
Okay, that's
So,
original.
so I know back when you were married to, you always used to, um, and but what's interesting is that in the third book you actually find out about his wife that he was married to through flashbacks. So you get chapters from the same perspective, from that guy's perspective, but then before his mind was erased. So now you know you
Okay.
do learn about these things because it's the same perspective at a different time.
See, for every limit of a point of view, there's some far-fetched way to get around it. So
Yeah.
no worries there.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about second person for a while? Not that there's a lot to say about it.
Well, obviously it's mostly used in a choose your own adventure type book, and if you don't know what that is, that's not too surprising because they're not very popular anymore. They used to exist when we were younger. They were more popular, but now they've been mostly replaced by video games, I think. What they were these books where if you read them, you are the main character, and so the book is talking at you. You are in a forest, and you are on the road to this or that, and then usually there's an interactive element to it, and it says something like, "You come at a door. Do you open it or do you go back? And then if you want to open it, go to chapter 15. If you want to go back, go to chapter 3."
Yeah.
Um,
Or pick a different
Yeah.
way. Do you pick the right road or the left road?
Yeah, and as you follow these chapters, the story is different each time.
Right. The chapters are usually numbered, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes it easier. And I think if we talk about tense for a while, those choose your own adventure type books are usually written in the present tense, which would make sense.
Yeah, because otherwise you've already made your choice
Yeah.
if it's in the past.
Did you choose?
Do you
door number
remember
one?
which one you
Or
chose?
door number two?
Uh,
Or was your memory erased? So the past is not usually used, and the future, I don't think someone ever did that, right? That would be something like, you will fall in a hole and hurt yourself. That
prophecy.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah, but not all the time in a choose your own adventure type. That would be ominous and
It seems like a very unpleasant kind of story to read.
yeah.
Yeah.
Unless it's you will win the lottery and buy a giant castle. I think there might be an audience for that one.
Yeah, maybe. Okay. So we've had second person. First person. What about first person?
I think first person is more popular nowadays. However, Moby Dick has a first person reflective narrator, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and back in the 19th century and also the 18th century, I think, there were these letter novels that were quite popular.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the whole novel was really just a collection of letters of people writing to each other. So it was always in first person.
Right.
So you could sort of follow the story by by reading their correspondence.
And it was not unclear to the reader who was talking. It always started with, "Dear Mary, yours
Yeah.
truly, Neville," or something.
Yeah. Dracula is, of course, a very famous first-person letter novel. I haven't seen any recent examples, although I've heard that they've done it with chat messages and emails, etc. in modern novels.
Actually, I had never read a novel in first person before I started the Hunger Games.
Oh, okay.
And I was actually quite surprised with the approach because, it was new to me. And I think it's really immersive. I really, really liked it, actually.
So the Hunger Games, what kind of first person would you say that is? Because there are several kinds of first person as well, right?
It's more like a camera kind of narrator that describes what the character goes through. And it's also...
As it happens.
As it happens. Yeah. And it also uses the present tense, which makes it very interesting.
Yeah. We're in it now. This is happening now.
It's very immersive because you actually feel like you're Katniss going through all of these.
Right, yeah. I open my eyes.
Yeah.
I have a headache. Someone's watching me, etc. Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of other YA books tend to use the past, which also works for me. I think it's pretty cool. But the present has the advantage that you don't know what's going to happen to the character. It's possible she might die because you have no idea. And with a past tense, there's kind of you get a reflective narrator, and you know the narrator, the character is all right.
Right, yeah, that's true. If the story is told as a reflection, it's pretty hard to sell the idea that the character dies, unless, of course, the character is in the afterlife and telling the story from the afterlife. But I think if you do that, it's better to do it from to show that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Rather than have it be a surprise twist at the end, because I think it feels like cheating then.
Plus, it's been done, right? The Sixth Sense.
What?
The Lovely Bones, in a way. That was.
Yeah, but in the Lovely Bones, you know the character is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But still, she tells the story from the perspective of being dead.
Yeah, that's true. The same is true in Witch Hunter, really. But again, it's clear from the beginning.
So I think a first person is very suitable to use if you have one interesting or charming main character or voice in your story. I think it's better for clarity's sake to have less points of view when you use this than more. For example, Sanderson uses just one point of view in the Reckoners series. And David is a very charming character, so that's
the main character.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of a geek who doesn't want to be called a geek.
The main character would have to be charming or fun or interesting in some way if you're gonna put up with this person for the whole book.
Yeah, and of course if you want more than one perspective, it gets harder to avoid confusion because you're talking in the I.
So changing from chapter to chapter, but always from that person, in the I person. Yeah.
For example, I think his name is Jos van der Loo. He's a Flemish writer, and he wrote The Love Tree, and he solves this problem of confusion by starting each chapter with the name of the character whose perspective he's using.
Right. So it would say like, Domien, I am sitting in the couch with Eline. And she's laughing at me.
Yeah, and
what's she thinking?
It so happens there's actually a character named Domien in the book.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's funny.
It's strange because I've had that book for years, and I only noticed when I had met you, and I had never heard the name before. So. But
Okay.
anyway.
So what are the advantages and the pitfalls of first person in general, do you think?
Well, I think we've talked about an unreliable narrator before. I think this one is the more interesting choice when you want to use that. Because a first person makes that easier than a third person. It kind of works better. For example, in the sitcom How I Met Your Mother, it's Ted Mosby who tells his story about how he met with two children, about how he met their mother. It's a very cool concept for a sitcom, I think. And he talks about his life and his youth and how he met all kinds of girls, but they were all not the right one. And as the audience, you keep wondering, is this going to be the woman he's going to marry? Is this the woman who's going to be his wife? And that's exciting. Only they kind of exaggerate it by adding season after season in which Ted Mosby actually turned out to be a slut who dated one girl after another until you were like, wow.
Yeah, I'm afraid he didn't catch syphilis or anything.
Yeah. And that kind of destroys the romance of the entire story. But I think
it's not very romantic
the concept
anymore.
is very interesting in that you keep wondering, is this the one? Is this the one?
It's an example of what bothers me in series is they stretch it and they sort of pull the rug out from under you so many times that you sort of give up. You get tired of it as a viewer. But
Exactly.
so on a tangent, this is a sitcom. This is not a novel. We've been mostly talking about the written word. But I just wanted to say that I think it's also always very funny in sitcoms when they've got this little flashback that they do when someone says, you know what happened this morning, and then and you see this whole scene play out, how that character saw it happen. But then they also give the another character's perspective, the same scene, but then suddenly everyone behaves very differently because it's from how they remember it.
Yeah, that's a nice example of using point of view in visual media, which we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
It's also very interesting.
But I just wanted to mention that before I forgot. Okay.
Maybe another thing we can mention about first person is that it keeps the learning curve we talked about earlier lower, because you can kind of cheat on these info dumps, because you when you're a character, your mind wanders and you might want to talk about this and then you start talking about something else.
Right, yeah.
And you can give the reader information, but one bit at a time.
Yeah, and you could also do it in the character's voice, which might make it more entertaining. For example, so you could have a scene where the main character goes like, "Oh, it's time for the annual winter festivities again, where they sacrifice 10 goats. Oh, I always like this because it's the one time I get to eat goat meat or something. I don't know."
Yeah, and then the character can talk about past occasions where he or she attended the same festival and things that happened, and it's all a bit slower and more
delivered in small doses.
Yeah.
Speaking of delivering things in small doses, I thought this was a good point to wrap up the first part of this conversation. Next week, you'll hear the second part in which Eline and I talk about storytelling viewpoints as they feature in other media beyond the written word. So we'll be talking about video games, movies, and audio drama. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please note that we also make our own audio stories, audio dramas. You can find them right here on this podcast, or if you're listening on YouTube, on this YouTube channel. And if you've enjoyed those, you can certainly always support us by purchasing the stories on Bandcamp, where you can get the whole experience without any interruptions, no ads, and in higher quality. And of course, there are also the USB audio tapes. You can find them on audiobooksontape.com. And if you like to read, we also have them as books. You can just find the books on Amazon. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to presenting the second part of this conversation to you next week. This is Domien, signing off.